Slaying Sunna, Abu Ishaq al-Shatibi's concept of Bid'ah in al-Iʻtiṣām, McGill University, 1999, Asif Saifuddin Jahar, Chapter 1, The Sufi Orders. The development of the Sufi orders was not generally accepted either by jurists, especially the extremist orders. Ibn Sab'in's teachings, for example, claimed that salat or sawm, fasting in Ramadan, and prayer for those who had reached the level of the real ulama was unnecessary. Moreover, his direct challenge to Maliki jurists contained an indictment against the readiness of jurists to permit men to have more than 4 wives, which was forbidden by the Mashhur al-Fuqaha, and to allow the consumption of alcoholic beverages. For Ibn Sab'in, the blend of fiqh, theology, kalam, Sufism, philosophy is important. Fiqh is the road to Shari'iyah. Ash'arism, the Ash'ari theology, is the road to theology, and Sufism the road to God's haqiqah, reality. For Ibn Sab'in, fiqh is not the only path to that reality, for it is based on reason alone, particularly qiyas, ratio legis, and hides therefore God's light from his servants. By his logic, therefore, it is jurists who have gone astray. We have seen, however, that it was fiqh that was considered the first step in understanding the divine law of God, and therefore the precursor to the tasawwuf. But in Ibn Sab'in's view, the foundations of fiqh, linguistic and divine laws based on reason for those of sound mind and are erroneous. For those of sound mind, the mukallaf are erroneous. His charge to jurists in this case was not proportionally true, for he generalized the error of all jurists without distinguishing between the pious or qualified jurists and the lax jurists in issuing the law. Ever since the 10th century, the role of jurists had no longer been restricted to religious affairs only, but had also come to include political theory. Once established in a given territory, their support was usually reserved for a particular ruler. Indeed, it was true of both jurists and Sufis that they were present in every corner of the Muslim world, and they were generally in a position to support one ruler over another. By implication, their role was not merely religious, but it also encompassed the indoctrination of rulers. For example, the Friday sermon was more than a religious ritual. It was also a political one in view of the fact that the names of rulers were invoked routinely. This distorted approach to the Friday sermon led Shatibi to condemn it as bid'ah. Some Andalusian jurists, such as Juan Sharisi, who died in 914, generally felt that reciting the names of rulers or sultans during the khutbah was forbidden. Izz ibn Abd al-Salam, for example, called it bid'ah and detested it. Nonetheless, the proximity of some jurists to rulers led them to adopt lax attitudes when implementing the law, an offence which earned them the contempt of both pious jurists and Sufis. The emergence of the practice of tasawwuf in Andalusia was often associated with the decadence of morality and the religious impiety found amongst some jurists and rulers. This class was accused of living a glamorous lifestyle while the population endured economic hardship. Moreover, it was said that some jurists were negligent in pronouncing religious principles. In the era of the Murabitun, when the Maliki school predominated, the speculative Sufi movement, however, was viewed with considerable suspicion. The disassociation of Sufis from recognized religious leaders had always been a cause for suspicion and resentment from the jurists. In contrast to the latter, who seemed to welcome their grounding in reality, participation in esoteric and mystical congregations, such as those for listening to mystical songs, chanting, were regarded as violent to the orthodoxy. For their part, the Sufis' relationship with the government rulers was far from harmonious. In fact, their very presence was regarded as a threat to the latter, who often imprisoned Sufis on the grounds that they deviated from the Shari'iyah. It was the jurists ultimately who were appointed as the Sufis' judges and executioners, a position they exploited in the interests of the ruling powers. For this reason, even the jurists were characterized as corrupt, given that they functioned not only as religious officials, but as advocates for the political interests of rulers. Sufi adepts aspire to a state of inner experience, which implicitly entails the possession of an esoteric knowledge, both unique and irreducible, unquestionably recognized by the faithful. The rapid spread of Sufi teachings was probably aided by the rigidity displayed by some Maliki jurists in responding to the changing needs of society. Fazlur Rahman may be correct in so far as he identifies the rigidity of the ulama, their system of legal casuistry and empty theological pedantry drove the more serious-minded men of religion into the Sufi fold. It cannot be denied, for instance, that some Andalusian jurists were enamored by Sufi doctrine. This sparked a reaction from Shatibi, who deplored the lax attitude which permitted jurists to amalgamate the exoteric with the esoteric. This did not mean that Sufism had no place in Islam or in juristic doctrine. Extreme Sufi practices, however, such as singing, dancing, and other orgiastic rituals were generally abhorred. Sufism claimed to lead adepts to direct communion with God was challenged by the jurists. Because the jurists also served as judges, it was common practice to amalgamate religion with politics. The Friday sermon, as mentioned above, was used as a forum for the pronouncement of the caliph's name. Jurists thus, to some extent, found themselves in direct opposition to Sufis in both the religious and political spheres. This schism can be detected in the words of the Andalusian Sufi who migrated to Tunis, Ibn Sab'in, who died in 669, 1270. Jurists are the true roots of the Shari'iyya. However, they digress in issuing fatwas, reasoning merely on the basis of their own desires and acting differently from what they proclaim. This critique was probably aimed at those jurists who were perceived as being prepared to issue fatwas in accordance with the needs of rulers. The polemic over Sufi and juristic practice was vigorous during Ash-Shatibi's time. The entire debate, it must be remembered, only occurred because of efforts of certain Sufis and jurists to amalgamate the two paths to the truth. The former often practiced asceticism with a certain legalistic element, while the latter mixed mystical Sufi methods with their own. This phenomenon was particularly characteristic of Spain and provoked many intriguing consequences. Shatibi describes how people who claim to be Sufis would, professing poverty, congregate at night in a home. The gathering begins with some communally recited dhikr. They then move on to singing, clapping their hands, and making ecstatic utterances until dawn. Some of the juristic participate in the gatherings, so that if anyone questions them about their behavior and the permissibility of their teachings, they merely respond that the jurists would not attend if they were illicit. In Sufism, God and world of man are perceived differently. The Sufi perception of the existence and unity of God underlies its unique brand of spiritual practice. Ibn Khaldun, who died in 1406, states that Sufi assumptions are identical to those of the Imami Shia concerning their Imam. The latter believed in two ways in which the oneness of the deity with the Imam was achieved. First, the essence of the primeval deity is hidden in all created things, including both sensibilia and intelligibilia, and are one to either perception. Second is the belief in the absolute oneness. The Sufis, moreover, consider the saints to be the pole of gnosis, which revolves around them, a doctrine reminiscent of the Shia tradition of Ali. Sufis were not in fact distinguishable from their fellow Muslims on the basis of any particular religious practice, but they were merely particularly models of religion and asceticism. Even in Shatibi's time, the lax attitude of jurists who practiced Sufism and the Sufi extremists who held to the tradition of the intuitive experience rendered the position of the Shari'iyya, and more specifically fiqh, precarious. Sufi ibadat were not categorically rejected by the jurists, but these methods, which were not clearly mentioned in either the Quran or the Hadith, were condemned as heretical. Innovation of this type was unacceptable to some pious muftis and jurists, in part due to their disdain for the intuitive experience. The Sufi concept of incarnation was, as Ibn Khaldun notes, in consonance with that professed by the neo-Ismaili Shia extremists. The latter believed that the incarnated Imams could reappear, a doctrine not known to the early Ismailiyya. Such concepts of incarnation and oneness later received more profound treatment in Andalusia at the hands of Ibn Arabi, who died in 642-1240, and Ibn Sab'in. It was also in Sufism that the theory of poles, Qutb, were articulated. This theory asserts that the chief Gnostic cannot be chosen from among those who seek it until God has taken him into himself. This theory was rejected by Ibn Khaldun because its intuitive and irrational basis, and because it deviated from the religious law. Al-Shatibi in al-Iʻtiṣām has written in response to this issue of innovation is an indicator of the development of his legal theory of after al-Muwafaqat, in view of its concern with the particular religious practices and the problems of Bida which the author perceived as permeating Islamic orthodoxy. The specific aim of al-Iʻtiṣām was to challenge the divergences from religious law and to reformulate the concept of Bida using a more epistemological legal approach. Stay tuned for many more parts.